Okay, well, on behalf of the Law School and the Booth School of the University of Chicago, I would like to welcome everyone today and thank you all for joining us. This is a special evening for a lot of reasons. A very special person, a great book, but also this is one of the first, since I've been dean, by the way, I should tell you who I am. I'm Mike Schell, and I'm the dean of the law school. But since I've been dean for now 2.5, 3 years, this is the first joint alumni activity that we've done with the Booth School, and I hope we can do many more together. Tonight we're delighted to present this program, which features a conversation between Richard Sandor, the Chairman and Chief Executive Officer of Environmental Financial Products, LLC, and Todd Henderson, Professor of Law at the University of Chicago. A financial innovator known as the father of financial futures, Richard Sandor has been at the epicenter of environmental and financial markets for more than 4 decades. In recent years, drawing on his years of experience with the Chicago Board of Trade, he founded what came to be known as the Climate Exchange family of companies, including the Chicago Climate Exchange, the world's first and only, and North America's only, voluntary, legally binding greenhouse gas cap and trade system, the Chicago Climate Futures Exchange, the world's leading futures exchange for environmental products, and the European Climate Exchange, Europe's leading exchange operating in the European Union emissions trading scheme. Now, Richard's recently published book, which I'm sure all of you have copies of, or will get copies and have him sign immediately after this talk, Good Derivatives, a study of financial and environmental innovation, a book that I picked up last night and took a good read through. It's a very interesting book, and it explores the creation of the Chicago Climate Exchange and its affiliated exchanges, examining how financial innovation, an often misunderstood concept, has been a positive force, which will strike many of you perhaps as surprising, but a positive force in the last 4 decades. And it's more than just an analytical or historical analysis of these important instruments. The book, in many senses, is a personal journey of an extraordinary pioneer. I'm proud of the role that the University of Chicago played in Richard's journey. Our legendary faculty member, Ronald Coase, was Richard's mentor, and his early work on financial futures was published in our journal, the Journal of Law and Economics. I'm also extremely pleased and proud that Richard has continued his relationship with the law school through his teaching and participation in programs such as the one tonight. And here to discuss the book and its broader implications with Richard Sandor is our own Todd Henderson. Todd is a 1998 graduate of the law school. He served as a clerk to the Honorable Dennis Jacobs of the U.S. Court of Appeals for the Second Circuit, and then practiced law at a small firm called Kirkland & Ellis in Washington, D.C., and then served as an engagement manager at McKinsey & Company in Boston. I think you left out your time in doing construction and building bridges, but it just goes on and on. Todd is a prolific scholar and an authority in the areas of corporate law and securities law and regulation, and there is no one who loves the University of Chicago and actually loves everything in his life more than Todd Henderson. So with that, I'd like you to join me in welcoming Richard Sandor and Todd Henderson.
Thank you all for coming. This week I read 2 memoirs, Dr. Sandor's and The Personal Physician of Mao Zedong. Like all great biographies, both of these taught me a great deal, transported me to another place and time, and made me wonder what it would be like to live someone else's life. At least in the case of Dr. Sandor, I can say this was a life very well lived. As we say at the University of Chicago, he's created enormous amounts of social welfare, and along the way had an enormous amount of fun. It just comes through in droves. In his book, he talks about beating Bobby Fischer at chess, true story, I won't tell you how old they were, working with the likes of Michael Milken and Jack Welch, eulogizing, along with Catfish Hunter and Reggie Jackson, the owner of the Oakland A's, and starting countless businesses, some of which succeeded, but most of all were horrible failures. His story is a quintessential American story, but what brings us here tonight is this is also a story about Chicago. In his book, he talks about Chicago as a place, quote, to create markets, and often wonders when faced with a problem, I think really any problem in his life, maybe we could create a market. This is a very Chicago thing to say. As he describes, New York is sort of the center of finance, and the West Coast is sort of the center of entrepreneurship, and Chicago is really about market makers and creating markets. Whether it was a market for interest rates, mortgages, plywood, stock futures, sulfur dioxide, or carbon, just to name a few of the markets that he created, one cannot come away from the book with anything less than a tremendous amount of admiration for the energy, creativity, and passion of Dr. Richard Sandor. So it's an absolute pleasure to be here. So let me just start out by asking you the easiest question for someone who's never done this. Serve the role of Phil Donahue or James Lipton, pick your interlocutor. What do you mean by good derivatives? And the implicit question in there is, what's a bad derivative?
Well, the good derivatives are Chicago style, or essentially those that are regulated, transparent, traded on an exchange, and where the contracts are fairly written and balance the needs of the buyer and the seller. The bad derivatives, those are unregulated, opaque, and generally don't have capital requirements that we have on exchanges. I think, if we can put up Greece as an example, Dean, if you're here, I'm sorry to use this. If we take a look at collateralized default swaps, okay? They were priced, that is, the chance of a default was 0.25%, and you could somehow insure against a Greek default. Yet Greece, since 1828, defaulted 50.6% of the times. Every 2 years there was a default. And people wrote these contracts, insured against defaults, for 0.25% when the probability was 50% that the country would default in 2 years. No margin was put up. Nobody looked at it. It was opaque. And we wonder why it nearly brought down the financial system.
So the regulation you have in mind, so one of the elements you said of a good derivative is regulation. Throughout the book, you talk about the kinds of markets you're involved in, and most of them involved some sort of self-regulation. In fact, when you created new products like environmental products, there were no laws really on point. So you said, well, we're going to seek out a regulator and create regulation. Do you have a great deal of faith in self-regulation? Is self-regulation sufficient? What do you see the role of the government as compared to self-regulation, or how those things interact with respect to?
We chose to be, Todd, when Todd was asking about that, when we were forming the Chicago Climate Exchange, we were an exempt commodity, and I called up Mary Shapiro, who was a longtime friend, and said, Mary, you're going to hear something you probably will never hear. I want to be regulated. And she laughed, and so we entered into a private-public partnership so that she would independently audit the emissions, check the smokestack data, and make sure that things were on the up and up. And we think that's very important, and I think it's a proper balance in the case of, if you're not regulated, to be self-regulated, and if you are federally regulated, to have a federal regulator and self-regulation working in harmony.
Well, let's come back to that. Let's take a step back, and I just want to quote something you say in your discussion about creating the Chicago Climate Exchange. You say you had to, quote, create the supply and demand of a product that didn't exist, as well as create a web of institutions to support this new market. I can tell you from reading this, I was just gobsmacked at the idea of even going about, give us a sense of how you go about this job, creating both supply and demand for a completely new product, in this case carbon, as well as all the ancillary institutions that surround it.
Todd, you do it with a lot of pain, a sense of humor, and you really have to create the notion that people can profit from not polluting versus the conventional knowledge that you make money from polluting. And you appeal to, in cases like Ford Motor Company, you ask them and say, look, you need to limit your carbon. And they say, well, we're going to be operating in a carbon-constrained world in Europe, so let's become leaders and beat the rest of the automobile industry. You go to a company like Baxter Labs, it's in the healthcare industry, and you say, you know, isn't this in your company's interest? And it is. And you go to power companies, and you go to people who have never traded anything, which you find in great abundance in Chicago, and market makers, and you say, will you please make a market that is offer to buy when people are selling and offer to sell when people are buying. And the great part about this city and what I love about it and the passion, there's no such thing as a bad idea within the Chicago exchange community. They were always up for everything, whether it was interest rates or acid rain or carbon emissions. It didn't much matter what it was. The chance to be a professional market maker appealed to a lot of the creative people in the city.
So I understand the idea that if the government tells me, I own a factory, and the government tells me, you're only allowed to emit 100 units of some chemical, carbon, sulfur dioxide, nitrous oxide, whatever it is. The idea of allocating 100 units, the government would say, here's permission to pollute 100 units. That's how much you're polluting now. And you can trade those, and if you can, by your inventiveness, reduce your emissions to 50, then you can sell that right to pollute the other 50 to someone else who may not be as efficient. And that gives you incentives, good monetary financial incentives, to be environmentally sensitive. That's not what you did with the Chicago Climate Exchange. There was no, we had signed the Kyoto Treaty, but we'd never ratified it. There were no external legal constraints that said you can only pollute this much. So how did it work? Why did anybody trade?
I think that we created both the demand by market makers, professional traders, companies that thought even if they had to buy, that it was worthwhile for them to take this commitment. And we created the sell side of the market in a similar way, convincing people that although the government wasn't acting, it was in their personal interest to reduce CO2 emissions, and that if they could do it effectively when mandation came, which seemed that it was going to come, they would profit by being a first mover. We ended up, Todd, with, on a voluntary effort, nobody committed, 450 members, 700 million tons of emission, about a market that's third the size of Europe. And essentially, our members cut 400 million tons, which is the size of emissions in France. And it was 17% of the Dow Jones, IBM, Intel, United Technologies, 11% of the Fortune Top 100 companies, Ford, Honeywell, Safeway, et cetera, and 20% of the power companies in America, all without a government mandate.
So this is a huge accomplishment. So when I push back here a little bit, don't take it the wrong way.
No.
So how much of it though was the fear of? I'm trying to understand what part of it is like the fear of the government coming eventually with this. You can only admit 100 because you have another chart in your book which says Super Tuesday happened and the political wind started to blow, and then we can talk about the politics of this in a little bit, but the political winds turned and carbon and cap and trade sort of went off the radar screen of the politicians and the prices on your markets completely collapsed.
Yeah.
which the lay reader reads that and says, it's just about anticipating future caps. And so the voluntariness component was with an eye towards the future and not really voluntary in a sense. Is that a fair criticism or not?
That's a fair criticism, but we accomplished a lot in the process. I mean, in the final analysis, anybody who's been in markets know, unfortunately or fortunately, there's two motivators, fear and greed. And we really appealed to both sides of that equation, to the people who were afraid it was coming and they would be unprepared. The greed part of it was they could make money by doing it better than anybody else. And the third component, Art Kelly will tell you, is people like Bosch that came in and wanted to learn how to do it and just did it on a voluntary basis. The key is, and I use the metaphor, Todd, of chess. I mean, when I was taught chess as a kid, I was taught that the game is controlled from the center of the board, okay? And that whether you're writing a futures contract or speaking to senators or you're playing football, the game is won between the 40-yard lines in football. It's in the chess game, it's in the center squares, and it's always a matter of finding a consensus, balancing, and not going to the extremities. And that's what we try to do, write a balanced contract where buyers and sellers meet.
We're having a little bit of problem with your microphone. I don't know if it's does anybody else hear that? Is it?
Okay.
Okay.
I'll stay mobile, as my wife just suggested.
You feel like you get to know your wife and your whole family, which is another added bonus of reading the book. I feel like I know them quite well. So I sense in this central square metaphor, which you used effectively to beat Bobby Fischer, you talk also about the change in Washington, which had a profound effect on the environmental initiatives that you started. And you had a great quote from when you went to see Representative Waxman in the push to get the carbon cap and trade bill passed. And there was a quote from one of his staffers. You were talking about trying to get credit in the cap and trade bill for people who had already taken initiatives. Farmers who were sequestering carbon in their fields and people who had voluntarily been on the CCX. And the quote was, "There will never be credit for early action because we don't need it to pass the bill." And this kind of really stuck in your craw, at least I got the sense in the book, that something had significantly changed in the last 4 decades when you went to Washington and worked with the CFTC initially in the 1970s about getting interest rate futures and the Ginnie Mae contracts to today. What's wrong? What went wrong, and how can we fix it?
Well, I don't think anybody here is surprised that the debt ceiling was passed 2 hours before the U.S. was about to default. We have a very unfortunate situation where there isn't governance from the center, in my humble opinion. That the centrists are the dinosaurs of today, and unless you play at the extremities, we have a situation that's broken legislatively, and I think that's self-evident to everybody. And I guess I had worked on the CFTC bill in the 70s. I'd worked on legislation on taxation in the 80s. I'd worked on the Clean Air Act of 1990s. The Waxman-Markey bill was 1,500 pages. Dodd-Frank is 2,100 pages. That is bigger than the New Testament, the Old Testament, and the Quran combined. So you can run 3 major world religions in less words than a piece of legislation in Washington today.
And that vastly underestimates because of the 270-odd rulemakings required by Dodd-Frank, not to mention the countless studies it would fill the room.
It's just out of hand. I mean, the Constitution and the Declaration of Independence and the amendments is 39 pages, okay, in the U.S. government pamphlet. The bill establishing the Fed was 50 pages. Sarbanes-Oxley for corporate governance was 166 pages. You can't get out of Washington without 2,000 pages coming at you. Now, as an arbitrageur, I ask, why are there 2,000 pages? And they reflect a lot of vested interests and actions that don't have to be taken. And they defend existing institutions, and they provide barriers to entry for new competitors. So these are all a dangerous part of where the political system has evolved.
Yeah, and you mentioned the fact that China and Brazil and India are being more innovative and developing more market-based approaches to environmental regulation than we are. We've sort of either given up on the environment, or where we have interest in the environment, our approach is sort of command and control regulation as opposed to deploying market forces. Do you have, there's an optimistic sense in your book for the so-called developing world, although it's hard to say they're really developing anymore. They're sort of,
I'm just struck by the fact that we tend to be veering away from markets, and we have low growth, a fragile economy, and a broken economy. The emerging nations like Brazil, China, and India are all moving away from command and control to markets. And it's just phenomenal that Washington relies completely on rules and regs today, from the EPA to control carbon, and every emerging nation is embracing markets. We don't have the right attitude towards speculation. Todd, you may appreciate this. When I was teaching at Berkeley, I ran into a wonderful man by the name of Abba Lerner. And he wrote a book called The Economics of Control. Ken, you're nodding. And he was the dean of communism. I mean, he was a left-winger of enormous magnitude, profoundly intelligent man. And I told him I was speculating in commodities at the time. And I was expecting him as a left-winger to say, this is a terrible thing, speculation. It's very, very dangerous. And he told me a story about Franco in the 30s. And he said, oh, I really think the speculation is okay. Let me tell you what happened with Franco in the 30s. And I said, what was that, Abba? And he said, he was having an enormous problem, much like we hear about gasoline today, Jake, much as we heard about food, that it was Chicago or speculators that were driving all this. So Franco had a unique solution, okay? He invited all of the speculators in Madrid to a central square and then had them all shot. And it worked, okay? They all were dead, and so their families had to sell the grain into the markets, and sure enough, it worked and prices fell. There was only a slight problem. They didn't carry any more inventories, so by the next year, when there was a drought, there was widespread famine, and numerous people died because nobody had kept buffer inventories. And we seem to market making, underwriting risk. There's a big difference between gambling and speculation. In gambling, there's no risk until you build a casino or you build a racetrack. Food prices go up or down independently of creating it. Electricity goes up or down. Commodities, and the question is, who's going to bear the risk? And if it's a legitimate risk that needs to be transferred, then market makers can play a good role, but this has been lost recently.
At various points, you talk about seeking approval from government regulators. And in the 70s, when you did this with mortgages and interest rate futures, you went to the CFTC, and they had an economic purpose test. So you had to convince them that you weren't building a casino. You had to convince them that, look, there are legitimate risks out there that need to be hedged. And I think, as you sort of colorfully describe it, there's a bunch of guys who grew up on the south side of Chicago who are happy to be the kind of speculators and bear those risks and facilitate these markets. This was repealed, this economic purpose test was repealed in 2000, the Commodities Futures Modernization Act. But notwithstanding this change, the CFTC recently denied applications, for example, of a company that wanted to create a market in political events, so predicting the outcome of political events. And my colleagues, Eric Posner and Glenn Weil from the economics department, have recently proposed a FDA for financial innovation. They want to basically put some teeth back in the economic purpose test. So I just wanted to, what role do you think the government should play at that level? That is this a casino or is this the Sandor version?
Well, my problem with that is it adds to yet another layer of bureaucracy that I worry about. My ideas, for example, I'm not sure. I think we are working on a way to treat water and to save endangered species, and I'm not sure I want a government regulator to figure whether that's good or bad. I'm not sure anybody as a young kid, I came to Chicago, and why I loved Chicago so much, Todd, is when I was teaching in Berkeley, the idea of financial futures, kind of came up in an academic setting that I was working on, and I took a sabbatical to become the chief economist of the CBT in '72, and I went around and advocated basically financial or interest rate futures. Well, you can imagine, I'm a 30-year-old professor from Berkeley, okay, in the 60s, and going around, and they said, why don't you go back to Berkeley and smoke dope or, do something constructively. Interest rates don't fluctuate. There's no demand for this. And so I worry about that sort of idea. The second thing I worry about is anybody who operates in an opaque market and has a monopoly, the last thing they want to do is see transparency. So the vested interest will fight you. It doesn't matter. If you describe the real price to somebody, the wholesale price, this makes wholesale people very annoyed. And if you're doing your job and you're attempting to be transformational, you're in a jiggly establishment. And so once that happens, then you get some money into a senator's campaign, and then you go to the House, and they lean on the regulators, and then you don't get anything that's disruptional, okay? Because the people who are in power don't want disruptive events in their lives, and so I worry about that. Where I think the problem should be solved is back to Greece. You need to, in Chicago language, you charge different margins for speculators and hedgers. You have capital and margin requirements. The problem is if the banks were told that they would have to reserve a very significant amount of capital if they wrote insurance on Greece or risky or subprime mortgages, it's not the problem that they do it. The problem is there's not enough capital reserve for them taking these risks. So an easier way to do it is say, you want to bet on Ireland going bust, or you want to bet on a subprime loan, you can do it all you want. You just have to have a lot of capital reserve to do that activity. And we do that in Chicago.
And of course, we try to do that with respect to banks. The Basel Accords said for these kinds of loans, you've got to keep this amount in reserve. And then, of course, the banks tried to arbitrage around that, which created a lot of financial innovation. I love the point about you being a disruptor. The quote in the book is when Dr. Sandor went to New York to convince all of these folks that they should take their products onto the Chicago exchanges, he said he felt like he was showing up and saying, I'm here from Chicago, and I want to narrow your spreads and reduce your profits, which is what taking things that are what we call trade on the over-the-counter market, a bespoke contract. You and I agree I'm going to trade this risk to you, but no one else knows about it. The price that I can charge you when you can't shop around is obviously much, much higher than the price that if you can instantly check prices from 20 other dealers. So then the question I guess I have from that is, in the over-the-counter markets that were largely New York centered, in things like mortgage derivatives, these were all in the over-the-counter market, and we saw they collapse famously. Why didn't Chicago offer a commodity version of those products as an alternative?
Well, I think there's a variety. First thing, let me backstep for 1 second, and because you ask about bad derivatives, and I ask you now all just to use your common sense now and think about what I'm saying, and then wonder about what the implications are. Fangy, you want to put up the credit agencies? Let me there are 4 companies in America that are AAA. There are 14 countries in the world that are AAA. S&P rated 17,000 financial instruments as AAA. Now, is there something wrong with that model? Does that make any sense to you that a quasi rating agency could rate 17,000 instruments, 17,000 AAA, and only rate 4 companies in 14 countries? So there is a disconnect, and there is a question of what is the role of the rating agency and how do they play. Why Chicago didn't adopt it, I think, is a very long story, but I think these products arose as Chicago exchanges were switching to electronic trading. They were tied up in demutualization. I think that there were things that were on their plates before new products were, and I do hope that the Chicago exchanges will get back to the inventing business.
As I was reading it, I don't want to sound too like I'm sucking up too much, but as I was reading it, I was thinking to myself, where was the 35-year-old Dr. Sandor? Because as we experience this enormous growth in these OTC derivatives, that's the role you'd played in the 70s and 80s and 90s, and then you were off doing this environmental stuff and a different stage in your life.
I think
you could have saved us.
I don't think that's the case, but I think there's a difference, and we have to ask, why did IBM allow Microsoft to exist? Okay, how did they hand the entire franchise of computers to Microsoft? Then you want to ask, why did Microsoft allow Steve Jobs to come into existence? Then you have to ask why Microsoft allowed Google to exist. Then you have to ask why Google allowed Facebook to exist. The fact is that these are you got to be in your 20s or maybe early 30s to be a disruptor, and I think that most of the invention may come from new exchanges and new startups rather than from existing. And if that happened, the exchanges would be no different than any other industry.
Let me ask a question about the environment. So you used the example of acid rain, which when I was a kid, that was all the environmental rage, right? I just vividly remember the images in news magazines of apple orchards in upstate New York, just sticks that were sticking out of the ground, and this was a huge problem. And our solution to this, and you were a big part of this, was brilliant, right? We have this obvious problem where the industrial companies and the smokestacks in the Midwest are sending this pollution. They're, in economist speak, externalizing the costs onto other people and privatizing the gains. And so we need them to bear those costs, and one way we can do this is cap and trade. And in the failure of carbon to follow this same path, and at points you talk about how the Republicans who had kind of abandoned market responsive environment. You sort of, I think you wrote, "Where have all the flowers gone?" A song from the '60s that I also like. One difference between sulfur dioxide and carbon is the connection between the harm seems to me to be much greater in the case of sulfur, right? A 10-year-old kid in Pittsburgh can see the apple orchards in upstate New York, and you can clearly see the connection from the smoke going with the prevailing westerlies. The idea of asking a society, you have to make sacrifices for your great-great-great-great-great-great-great-great-grandchildren. I don't think we've ever done that as a society. I don't think we've ever asked people to make those kinds of sacrifices based on somebody's guesses, a lot of scientists' guesses.
As a colleague of yours at the University of Chicago, the question is, what's the cost of that sacrifice? And I argued it was de minimis. You could reduce carbon emissions in the United States for a couple of $1 billion, okay? Given that we are a $14 trillion economy, that doesn't seem like a lot of money. So what are the costs and what are the benefits? Today, you might have asked right now, what about cholesterol? You can't prove it, but you have enormous obesity problems in the United States. You ask people to sacrifice and not to eat, fast food that may be too caloric. But you have to weigh benefits versus costs. And it was our opinion that it could be solved in a low-cost way. But, we're in a position that I don't understand how we don't have a space program. We have to rely on the Russians to launch rockets in the United States. This is beyond belief to me. We have abandoned education. We're not putting out the number of mathematicians and scientists we should. And I asked $2 billion here, $30 billion here, versus $40 billion in cigarettes and $60 billion in alcohol. These weigh very low in terms of social costs versus the social benefits. So, where does that come from? I blame a lot of that on the election cycle. If you're a politician, you're not interested in a 1 in 50-year event if you're serving 2 or 4 years, right? Because the odds are it won't hit during your time of being elected and be in public service. So we find things like Katrina or no flood control or bad things happening because the political cycle doesn't fit the economic cycle. And that, to me, is the danger. We don't worry about, long-term consequences of either obesity on one hand and the social costs, because it's not in our time of election. I've got grandkids. I worry about this, and to me, it's an important thing that we somehow look intergenerationally. But, our politicians don't have that. They're good at one thing, they're good at many things, and they're very smart. But the most important thing that they're good at is getting reelected, right? They do that job fabulously, better than anybody else and better than anything else they do. And so the problem is, I think, the disconnect between the economic cycle and the political cycle, which makes education, healthcare, environment, all social issues put to the back of the priorities, and those are where we, as a nation, I think, need to be. We don't support fundamental research anymore the way we once did. We don't do the R&D we once did. And I think it's a mismatch.
What are the biggest markets to be made? You go out in the world and you see problems and you say, let's create a market. You did this with, I'm going to not say it right, the Indian biogas program. What are as you look 10, 20 years in the future, what are the big markets that the 30-year-old Sandor would go out and create? You mentioned a couple, I think, water and endangered species.
Yeah.
I'd like to hear about what those are.
I think water is simply the most important commodity of the 21st century. It will, in effect, change whether we live or die. And we don't have enough water, either quantity-wise or quality-wise. I don't think, if you look and read deeply, I think that Tibet is not about religion. It's about water. It's where the rivers that basically people thirst for in India and China. That's a water issue. I think South Sudan is a water issue. You could have piped water in. You have 365 conflicts or so that exist today, wars that are going on. A lot of the underlying reasons are water. The Punjab is drying out in India. China is 25% desert now. Okay, we have emerging populations, 170 million in Nigeria. You know, lots of oil, no water. And I worry about civil conflict that will arise out of the world's need for water. I think there's huge markets, some of which I can't talk about because I might have to take the company public at some point again in the future. I don't think I got another couple of ideas, but I think the application of markets and financial incentives to produce social outcomes. We've got to redo our medical system in the United States. This is terrible, okay? We have no proper incentives to get social outcomes. I think there's a role for markets there.
Is that the one you're not allowed to talk about, or?
It's a little related.
Well, tell me. So give me one specific example that you're not hoping to turn into your.
Well,
next
I'll
project.
give
Is
you
it like water. How do you make a market out of water?
Okay, so we got a called by the Alberta Water Research Institute, and we have a consulting contract with them. Alberta, which is like the Texas of Canada, it's rich in oil, will run out of water before it runs out of oil. Okay, you can think of that. They will not have enough water to produce the oil. So now you go to the center of the chessboard. So who's competing for water? Municipalities, farmers, and industrial users, right? And the oil companies, and wildlife, all of the social goods, right? And there is a way to do it. You don't need to, if you want to take a 2-hour shower, you ought to pay for it. That's recreation, that's not health and hygiene. Right? You need 20 to 30 gallons a day for hydration and hygiene. Albuquerque, the per capita consumption is 175 gallons a day. People flush toilets, you know, to throw a piece of paper in it, right? You use it as a garbage disposal, boom, 5 gallons, you know. If you take a look, there's no need to conserve. Why, Todd? Because it's, quote, free. The result is you've got Kentucky bluegrass growing in Arizona, creating asthma and every kind of malady in the world because they're sucking it out of the Colorado River for nothing, and therefore go take a shower for 2 hours. I don't care if you like taking a shower for 2 hours. I just want you to pay for it. You know, you need to treat it as a luxury good, not as a zero valued good.
And you want the Southsiders from Chicago telling us what the price is of that, as opposed to the bureaucrats in Washington.
Right. I don't want to see a regulatory fix to it, because then they'll ration it. If somebody wants the freedom to use as much water for their pool or for their grass or for their recreation, and they're willing to pay for it, then there are other people who could make money from, you know, having a dual flush toilet, right, for solids and liquids, where you don't, there's a lot of simple fixes to these things, but there's no financial incentive. Let me mention, if I can, Todd, the Kerala story. So In India, the poorest province is a province called Kerala. And basically in Kerala, the young women would go out and forage for wood and do things like that. And they really were robbed of going to school, robbed of educational abilities, etc. So we came up with a program where they took the animal waste, put it into what's called a digester. The methane would rise from the cow dung, and they would pipe the methane into the house, and it would be used for heating and cooking. They weren't using these digesters that a multinational organization had given them for free. So we said, look, if you do that, you can sell the avoided emissions of methane into the atmosphere. And methane's 21 times more potent than carbon. And so we started a pilot program where the farmers would take the animal waste, produce methane, and use it. It stopped the girls from going out. It allowed them to go to school, and the farmers made $20 a year. Now, you may not think that's much, but in a dollar a day, part of India, 20 or 30 bucks a year is a lot that came in. Well, we grew from 3,000 to 15,000 to the last year. We had 100,000 rural poor families that we were putting $20 a year into their budget. And that's from a price of carbon or $2 or $3. So you can have incentives like that, which will change behavior dramatically. And I think that's what we don't emphasize enough, the power of price to change behavior.
That is a fantastic note to end on, an inspiring story that you can read more about in Dr. Sanders' book. And I think it's now time to hear from you. I've asked enough questions. So if you have questions, there's a microphone, and we have someone who's walking around who will come and bring you a microphone so you can be heard. So now's your opportunity to ask questions, please. And I teach at a law school that deploys a very aggressive Socratic method. So if people don't volunteer, I may actually call on someone. I see some former students out there. I see colleagues. Please.
Art?
You mentioned several times Greece in the presentation and credit ratings, and specifically credit ratings to countries, which are all important issues in our environment and our business, but probably more important, especially important since we're in this Great Recession. In your opinion, what do you think the best way is to attack this situation in Europe? The crisis there, the debt crisis, the unemployment crisis, the growth crisis. What do you think the best method is to try and stem that, or possibly even reverse it at some point?
Well, I think, number one is that we have to have capital-based rules for the financial institutions, that this is a critical basis and change the banking system where it goes. I like to say, when we think of 2007, 2008, there was not one exchange that was bailed out. Of the 78 derivative exchanges around the world, the Chicago model prevailed. No federal money, no bailouts, all done separately. So I think we have to get a lot of these financial products with capital-based rules, and that will stem a lot of the bad things. And the proactive way is to promote transparency and to promote things on exchanges. And if they're not on exchanges, they should be self-regulated with proper margining and proper capital requirements. Mark?
If you could identify yourself when you ask your question, let us know who you are. That would be great.
Art Kelly. Richard, you talked about the developing markets embracing market-based systems whereas Washington is moving more toward centralized planning. If I may try to be your straight man, I recall that you have a wonderful story about being invited by the Chinese Communist Party to come to Beijing.
Yeah, I mean, the bottom line of the story is I got better reception for my ideas in Beijing than I do in Washington, is the, the simple thing. And Ronald Coase's name, along with Friedman and Karl Marx, are the most prominent names in China. And it's strange to me that a Chicago-based economist would be revered in China and relatively, not revered in our own country. It's like Tuesday and Maury's, I have lunch with Professor Coase, and to this day I can't call him anything but Professor Coase because he's my teacher, and Raphael and I had lunch with him a couple of weeks ago. He's 101 years old. And he just finished a book on how China became capitalist. And he's starting a new professional economics journal called Man and the Economy at the end of the year at 101. And he's now taking some research that he did on beer production and based upon poor water quality in the Thames River. And redoing his research that he did. So he gets up every day with a purpose at 101 years old. And he scares the daylights out of me. And one of the reasons that I wrote the book is I wouldn't have to face him with him asking me, how's the book going? And a couple of people who worked with me at the time said they'd never seen me, Mike McGregor, as scared as I was when I was late on delivering a chapter to him. But I think that whether you go to China or India or Brazil, they hunger for market-based ideas. And you go to Washington and they have no interest in it. And I gave a talk at the institute that does the 5-year plan. Everybody knew who Ronald Coase was. And so, and I gave a talk at Peking University. And it's on the environment and cap and trade. And so there's 100 young people in the audience. Max age 25. So I dutifully prepared my slides in English and Mandarin. And I started the talk, and the dean goes like this to me. Up the level, you're talking down to the students. And forget the Mandarin, just talk English. Don't put these Chinese slides up here, So I said, okay. And then the questions start getting really probing. And then one young woman, maybe soaking wet, 21 years old, raises her hands and says to me, why is the European carbon price higher? Why is the market backwardated? So here's a 20-year-old environmental student asking me about the price of carbon in Europe relative to the United States. So Peking University has an undergraduate emissions trading club. Now, we have bright students at the University of Chicago, as bright as they come, but here's a bunch of 20-year-olds that basically sit around and talk about carbon prices in a club. and as university after university I went to, I lectured in English. There wasn't anybody who wasn't bilingual. And it was just phenomenal to me how backwards we are with regard to languages, be they Eastern or Western. And there's a big difference, Art. And, we have to really understand what's happening.
I should point out that at least in 3 or 4 places in the book, Professor Coase suggests to Dr. Sandor, this idea you have would make a great research paper. And of course, the Berkeley professor, becoming the entrepreneur that he was, he put aside the research topics and instead focused on creating the enormous social value that he did. Some of those actually were then picked up decades later by my colleagues and turned into path-breaking research. So there were countless times when, and for the record, Professor Coase has never said that about any of my ideas. So there were many wonderful paths that Dr. Sandor could have taken. Ken, you had a question?
One of the things I like about the University of Chicago, Richard, is there's a lot of interest in market solutions. One of the things I'm not so happy about is there's very little analytical thinking about politics. So what can we say other than express total cynicism about the failure to put a price on carbon, whether by trading or by more direct governmental means? It just hasn't taken on any life of its own, apparently.
I'm not sure I understand, Ken, about what are the alternatives?
No, why are politics failing us on this? Is it interest groups? Is it cynicism? Is it Congress that's non-functional? What's going on?
It's a bunch of those things. One, if you take a look at U.S. industry today and look at and ranked the amount spent on lobbying and put a second list of what are the most troubled industries in America, they seem to map each other. So who spends the most? Financial institutions. Who spends the second most? Energy. Do we have an energy policy? Third, who spends the most? Medical groups and insurance companies. So every problem industry also happens to correlate with the amount of money spent on lobbying. That's number one. Number two, when I was advocating with Waxman-Markey, I came back to the Senate. I had worked on the Clean Air Act of 1990, which allowed and enabled acid rain trading. So I went back in 2008, which is 18 years later, to talk to the senators about doing what had been done in 1990, which cost the U.S. economy $1 billion to $2 billion and saved in medical expenses $125 billion a year, according to the EPA. And 2/3 of the senators were not there when the Clean Air Act was passed. That's number one. The average staffer was probably 27 years old, so they were 6 years old when acid rain was a problem in the United States. So there is no institutional memory in elected politicians. And then three, I think that basically the legislation has grown because it matches the cynical view that campaign contributions, legislation is there and it's constructed. So I think it's partially it's not that these people aren't terrifically smart. They are very smart. I don't think they're properly incentivized. I mean, I have the greatest respect for our elected officials' intelligence. I don't think they're irrational. My problem is they're rational. They have the wrong incentives. Not that they're not either good-hearted or smart. The incentives don't match the social objectives, and that's where we run into problems. And I think I don't know what it would take to get that to change. Maybe term limits, something that doesn't perpetuate. We've never had a political class in America until recently. And we now have a political class, and that's a hard thing to bust. And by the way, I think all of the social objectives, I think these are good-hearted people. I don't think anybody doesn't want to see better education, better schools, better health care. It's just no way to do it. And how can you have a country where 18% of the expenditures are on health care, and our life expectancy is lower than countries that spend half that amount. It doesn't add up.
One more question, here in the front, please.
Thanks. Melissa Fado. I don't know if my question is relevant to today, but you're talking about water. And you know, I have recently been to a number of islands. And I was struck with one of the islands they're all in the ocean, so saltwater, had desalination plants. Like, this is great, makes sense. The number of islands that have no desalination and they're barging the water in, and it's bad water anyway. And I would wonder, wouldn't it be more economically viable to actually have desalination plants for these?
The answer is yes, Melissa. You would have it more economical, but again, if you put a price on water, then maybe you'd get further technological change. If you can change the behavior of 100,000 rural poor Indians with incentives, why can't you change water consumption and clean water and health with similar types of incentives? And I guess I fall into back to the Chicago school, and maybe, and I have to say it because whatever dreams I ever had and Ellen ever had and my kids ever had were realized in this city, you know, whether it was the exchanges or now at the University of Chicago. It's made my life ultimately richer. And I do think the philosophy at the university of looking at markets, looking at private incentives should be re-examined, especially in a time and era when everybody thinks markets are lethal, that they don't perform the functions, that there's an intellectual basis for free markets here at the University of Chicago. The exchanges in town do this. Things like Ginnie Mae futures lowered housing costs by $6,000 a person on an average home. People get natural gas and heating oil because they can hedge, and poor people in the inner cities. We seem to be farmers, have been managing weather risk for years, and we need to focus on the fact that market efficiency and social welfare, okay, can be balanced, and that there is a solution, and it's called the Chicago solution. And we don't take enough account of that.
A great note to end on. I incur this is an incredibly timely and interesting and thought-provoking book, and I commend it to all of you. And so before we thank Dr. Sandor, I just want to say there's some more reception. I see some undrunk bottles of wine and some appetizers. So please join us as the reception continues. And please he's going to sign some books.
I'll sign some books, but most importantly, let me thank Mike Schill, for making this all, my dean, my boss, and
Our
Todd,
pleasure.
and Todd, my colleague, for helping make this happen. And thank you all for coming. It means a lot to me to see so many friends and familiar faces.
Thank you.